When I was in university, I took a sociology course where in the first term we covered the Salem witch trials and how it was mostly the women who were persecuted based on the way that their personality was, their lifestyle, or whatever it may be that their neighbors and their church would deem to be abnormal. Meaning that the women that were most likely to be accused of witchcraft were those who were living alone, who were not married, who had a bit more of an outspoken personality, who may have been a bit more promiscuous, basically just an independent woman living her life. And this made me think about how I would most likely be accused of witchcraft if I was suddenly cast back into the 1600s, and how a lot of you guys probably would be too. Which leads us to today's video, where I will be listing a number of ways that would have had you going straight to Gallows Hill if we lived back in the Puritan times. Now, for those of you who are not very familiar with what happened during the Salem witch trials, very briefly, what happened was that in Salem, Massachusetts, between 1692 and 1693, which was very heavily influenced by Christianity at the time, over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft and worshiping the devil, ultimately sending 20 people, 14 women and 5 men, to be executed under the suspicion of witchcraft. There are a lot of characters involved in the Salem witch trials, and I'm planning on doing a whole video covering this topic, going into the intricacies of what happened in this little town that led to it having such a huge mark on history due to such horrific actions. But for the sake of this video, not being super long, we will just leave it at that. Some of the ways that accused witches were tortured for information or confessions, not just in the Salem witch trials, but in the witch trials in general, were completely terrifying. They stemmed from things like sleep deprivation, to being forced to sit on stools that had been placed in fire, being tied up and tossed into the water, and if you sunk, you were innocent, but if you floated, you were guilty. Other evidence was the touch test, where someone afflicted with witchcraft would be touched by the witch, and if their fits stopped, then that meant that this was the person who had made the victim hysterical in the first place. Many of which were later recounted, but it was also random things like if you had a book on astrology. But honestly, a lot of the evidence put forth in the Salem witch trials was based off of hearsay, based off of lies, off of fear, off of paranoia, and family and friends and neighbors were all turning against each other, causing innocent lives to be taken on such dumb grounds that later on a lot of the truth did come out, but at that point it was too late. And as we're about to get into, some of the ways that people were accused of witchcraft and the so-called evidence is absolutely ridiculous. So hello to all of my witches, because I'm sure we all check off quite a few of these boxes. So as I mentioned, a lot of the Salem witch trial accusations revolved around women. So if you identify as female, then you already have that working against you in 1692 Salem. Essentially, people believed that women were more likely to give in to the ways of the devil than men were, making them more of a treasonous target during this time. If you were a woman who was eccentric, who was sassy, who was confident, even if you just wore makeup, these behaviors were seen as being odd and made the woman appear as untrustworthy, not the normal, soft-spoken, obedient housewife persona that so many women molded into back in those days. Then that almost certainly put you under the suspicion of witchcraft, because why on earth should a woman be assertive or stubborn? Or, even more hilarious, if you were a woman who had other female friends that you would hang out with all by yourselves, that most likely meant that you were having a coven meeting and doing your witchy spells. Essentially, if you had so much as committed any sort of sin as written about in the Bible, then this could also lead to an accusation of witchcraft. As well, if you were either poor or financially independent. Sarah Good, one of the women in Salem who was hanged, was a beggar who would go door to door asking for food in order to stay alive. And because of this, she wasn't trusted by her neighbors because she didn't have a family to support her. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there were women who were able to support themselves without a husband, be it they never married or they were widowed. This lifestyle just did not make sense to a lot of people living during this time, as the common thing to do as a woman was to find yourself a suitable husband who would marry you and take care of you. If you were having sex and you weren't married, that was another reason to cast you as a witch, because a scandalous woman was not something those Puritans were down with, especially if your activities got you pregnant. But of course, this did not apply to the same extent to the men that these women were banging, because the patriarchy. And going back to the makeup thing I was saying earlier, wearing lipstick was considered evil because it would seduce men into committing adultery, so it's the woman's fault, and now she's a witch because she painted her lips. Another alternate spectrum was if you were a young or an old woman. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter was in jail for 9 months after confessing to witchcraft because she didn't know what the fuck she was talking about. She was 4. But her confession apparently was enough to implicate her mother into being executed, which is absolutely horrifying. And then older women, regardless of marital status, were also commonly accused of witchcraft because old people were seen as being a nuisance to the village. But if you're a middle-aged woman, don't think that you get off scot-free, because the majority of women accused of witchcraft in Salem were 40 to 50 years old. So basically, it all boils down to woman equals witch. Women who had no children or just a couple of children were also at risk of being accused of witchcraft, because in the Puritans' minds, that meant that the devil had cursed your womb into not conceiving thousands of children, especially if your neighbor and their thousands of children were struggling. Like, for example, if it was the middle of winter and your neighbors and their, 10 kids were struggling, and here you and your husband and your only child are having a good old time, Goody Smith next door is probably pissed and thinks that you've been consorting with the devil, and that's why you're not struggling too. And then again, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if your neighbors are having trouble getting pregnant, it obviously means that you next door are casting your witchy spells on them in order to make them not able to conceive. Or if you had a bunch of children, that meant that the devil had given you a womb that was unnaturally fertile, making all of your children cursed, and that you were then stealing the souls of babies that belonged to those who were having a hard time conceiving. Like, you just could not win back in the 1600s. That was the thing about these witch trials too, was that everyone was accusing one another. Like, God forbid that you'd ever had an argument with somebody in the past, because you can be damn sure that that person's going to remember that come accusation time and throw you under the metaphorical bus. If you were suspected of witchcraft, a common way to see if you were or not was to make you recite the Lord's Prayer. Apparently, if you were a witch, the devil made it so that you were unable to speak Bible passages out loud, and so they would make the accused woman read this Lord's Prayer, and if she so much as stumbled or wasn't able to read, as many women were not taught how to back then, or if you were scared and missed a word, or you were just bad at public speaking, well, too bad for you, because that was said to be proof that you were a witch. And if you were any sort of healer, that roused suspicion for witchcraft, as women who had professions such as midwives or healers in general, they knew lots of stuff about herbs, medicinal practices, how to make someone feel better, and some people probably thought that she would also know how to make some people feel worse. So healers who would help those who were sick were not to be trusted, because they would tell the villagers to follow their medical advice, and if they didn't, they would continue to be sick, which apparently equals witchcraft. And then midwives who assisted in births, a job that was seen as being dirty, made you someone who was there to pretty much just eat the babies or sacrifice them to the devil or something stupid like that. Even using innocent forms of divination, such as peeling an apple and throwing it over your shoulder to see if it spells out the initials of your future husband, dumb things like that that young girls would do for fun, was seen as witchcraft as well. It seems that even just having a crush would be seen as the devil's work, because teenage girls would be all like, oh, I'm gonna dress all cute tomorrow to make Tom at school notice me. That type of thing would probably be seen as some sort of glamour magic, when in actuality it's just dumb hormones. And then a weird one was if you had spoiled milk in your fridge, that could put you up for suspicion of witchcraft. I guess this was a thing that they would make sure to ask during the trials, as it was noted in a bunch of the convictions. Then if you had some sort of mark on your body, like a birthmark, a beauty mark, a mole, something like that, it's probably even freckles, things like that that so many people, not just women, but so many people have. Looking for these things was a common way of determining if somebody was a witch. as any sort of mark found on the body of someone accused of witchcraft was called the devil's mark, a place where the witch's familiar would drink her blood from, where the woman, aka the witch, would then fly with her familiar to secret witchy meetings and orgies at night, which sounds like a grand old time to me, but so basically, long story short, is that pretty much anything would have made you a witch back in Salem in the 1600s. So that's fun. If you guys think that you would be accused of being a witch back in Salem in the 1600s, definitely leave me a comment down below. And if you're new to my channel, please be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you have not already. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.